Hello and welcome to interest.co.nz. I'm Janae Tibbs-Shirani and today I'm joined by University of Auckland Law Professor Jane Kelsey. Jane is probably best known for speaking out against the Trans-Pacific Partnership Agreement, but today she joins me to talk about her new book, The Fire Economy. I've got a copy here. Jane has made a brazen attack on the neoliberal system we've been living in since the 80s. She says it's created a fire economy, an abbreviation for an economy that's had its wealth created by the financial, insurance and real estate sectors. She warns we're in for a major economic crisis if we don't change tack soon. So, Jane, you've made some pretty bold calls in this book. What are some of the problems that you see with this fire economy at the moment?
Well, it's not just me seeing the problems. One of the features of the book is that I rely heavily on the kind of debates that are happening internationally, especially a lot of the research papers coming out of the IMF's research unit, where they're pointing to the real problem of the kind of financialised system of capitalism we have now, where you have not only asset bubbles and financial flows that are effectively unrestrained and invisible in shadow markets, but that they see a lack of regulatory frameworks and a lack of ethics as being a problem. And so it worried me when I was writing the book, and it's been about 5 years in the making, so it's brewed while the financial crisis and its aftermath have been rolling out. You know, one of the things that struck me is that we're in a kind of cocoon here, where you have the IMF and the Bank for International Settlements and others saying, you know, New Zealand is in really dangerous territory by our levels of foreign debt and our exposure to the fire economy. But at the same time, we have people talking about us being a rock star economy. And it's a classic of what researchers who've done quite a lot of work for the IMF, Reinhardt and Rogoff, call a state of denial. And so even though what's in there might seem radical in terms of the debate in New Zealand today, it's not radical in terms of the international debate at all.
You talk about New Zealand sort of heading potentially for a crisis or having all the conditions in place to have a crisis in the future. I mean, a lot of people say that actually we've come through the GFC really well, and you know, what would need to happen for us to actually get to that breaking point?
Well, there are lots of different ways that crises can erupt. And one of the things I do is to take a kind of checklist that's developed again by some of the IMF researchers who point to the features not only since the 1970s, but in particular since the global financial crisis, that are trigger points for crises. And that includes very high levels of leverage and very high levels of household and rural and private debt. And whilst we kind of have an obsession here with public debt, our levels of private debt, including private foreign debt, are incredibly high. And there's a really interesting discussion offshore about whether countries can have too much finance, not only because it creates instabilities, and especially when it's linked into the international fluid markets, but when money therefore is not being put into the productive economy, real jobs, real things, but money is put into making money out of money. And there is a point at which the money go round actually can't continue.
Sure. No, that makes sense. And how do we move this debate from an ideological level? You know, these arguments make a lot of sense there to a practical level. What sorts of policy changes or structural changes, I guess, do you suggest? I know that's a big question.
Well, I mean, I'm not an economist, I'm a lawyer. There are certainly amongst the international economists important debates about what has to shift in the global economy, away from a financialised system of capitalism or a fire economy to a different structure and framework for the economy. And people like Martin Wolf, the Financial Times journalist, and others have been presenting those arguments. My interest as a lawyer, or someone working in policy and regulation, is that it's not simply the economy that needs to change. It's the mechanisms of what I call neoliberalism, of the regulatory regimes, the monetary policy, the fiscal regimes, the risk-tolerant approach to regulation, the Public Finance Act, that are all major infrastructures for this particular kind of economy that we've had since the in New Zealand since the mid-1980s, but globally since the late 1970s. And that it's not enough to change the economy, you actually have to change the regulatory frameworks as well. And in that sense, again, there's some really important international discussion about the failures of inflation-targeted monetary policy and the problems of focusing on public debt as opposed to understanding the importance of private debt, and the need to have merit-based regulation as opposed to just disclosure and surveillance. And so it's those structural features that I'm in particular interested in and is a major focus in the book.
Sure. If we talk about the Reserve Bank and the Reserve Bank Act first, you're talking about, you do mention there the mandate that the Reserve Bank has and broadening that. How can we change that?
Well, the Reserve Bank Act is actually easy to change in that it's a statute, and statutes can be made and unmade. The most important features, obviously, are the price stability objective, and there have been attempts recently in the Parliament, supported by Labour, led by New Zealand First, to actually broaden that mandate. But there's a kind of a watchdog, or I refer to them as fire alarms, that are also put in place. The independent board, the independent governance structure, and the contractual relationships between the governor and the board and the government are designed to insulate that inflation targeting objective from political interventions. Now, many other countries are saying political interventions are increasingly needed. We've set up a structure that makes that difficult. So just changing the objectives without looking at the overall framework, I think is problematic. But Stiglitz, for example, suggests that you can do that. You can keep your independent board and have broader objectives. We kind of have this fixation here that no one can touch the Reserve Bank Act. And we need to break through that and actually realise that elsewhere people are pointing to this kind of mechanism as being one of the causes, not just for the GFC, but for potential future crises.
Right, so the government sort of getting involved there?
Broader and more balanced objectives to start with. I mean, even if you look at Australia still has the old legislation. They never went down the path that we did of price stability as being the primary objective. And I think we kind of have this holy grail approach to monetary policy, as if what was adopted here in the mid-1980s in practice and late 1980s in law is now what should be forever. And that debate is happening offshore, and that debate needs to be happening here. We have had discussions about the impact of monetary policy in relation, for example, to the property bubbles. If the objective is price stability, but price stability doesn't include the real estate market, then you have some contradictions you need to deal with. And I think the Reserve Bank is struggling to grapple with that, even though it might not think it's a struggle.
Yeah, sure. Okay, and something else which you talk about, I suppose, is the relationship government has with the private sector and public-private partnerships, and you're sort of calling for them to be, for the government to sort of walk away from these types of arrangements. What are your thoughts about this?
Well, public-private partnerships are the modern form of privatisation. One of the concerns I raise about them in terms of the Public Finance Act is that they're kind of off balance sheet. that there is not a lot of visibility. There's a lot of controversy internationally about PPPs and PFIs because they're a guaranteed income stream to what's basically a consortium of financiers, construction sector and the management industry. And when you end up having problems about whether PPPs are working, you end up with big contractual disputes, often fought out in the international arena in investment disputes. And they have basically a priority call on government funding at a time when you have constraints on, if you have a crisis or a recession and the government needs to decide what are its priorities. I don't think people understand the implications of PPPs and PFIs at all well, especially at the local government level. And if we look at what happened with the Mangawhai sewage scheme, I think that's a real lesson that what appears to be a nice quick fix of being able to get your funding long term comes back and bites you.
Sure. I mean, would you not argue that in some cases it is a good way of combining, resources by the government and by the private sector, to achieve an outcome?
There are very different ways. We've had government procurement for many years, and a procurement contract that is well drafted is fine. Public-private partnerships that are basically long-term income streams for doing what the state previously did, but which the state can't effectively tender for because of the way that the public sector comparator is built into the contracts, is a very different thing. And again, even Labor here didn't like them. Labor did one such contract. When it came to other infrastructure such as the private prisons, they said that's not appropriate for the private sector to run. This particular government has gone hell for leather down the path of PPPs and PFIs without there being much debate. And these are long-term contractual arrangements. They'll bind for 15, 20, 25, 30 years into the future. So they tie the hands of future governments and their income streams.
Sure. Jane, I mean, this whole sort of neoliberal economic system, and we can argue as to whether that what we have now is still class neoliberal. I know that's a contentious term in itself. But how do we really change the system when we actually operate in a global network? I mean, New Zealand's economy is connected to other economies, and we can't really do one thing while the rest of the world does another thing. How do we sort of, get somewhere in the middle?
Well, first thing I think we need to understand here is that the world outside is actually changing. And there are important debates that are happening about the role of the state and the need to bring the social and the political back into the market. That's still anathema here. But I think we need to have a mature debate now about that and not simply have scaremongering whenever any political party starts to suggest that the state might have a role. The second set of things that we can do is to avoid digging ourselves deeper into the international connectedness through regimes that make it difficult for us to change tack. Now, that doesn't mean closing ourselves off from international relationships, but one of my concerns about the trade and investment agreements that we're signing now is that they are designed to lock in current models and tie the hands of governments when they want to shift in the future. And we need to have the flexibility to do that at a time when things are really changing quite dramatically in the world. But I think the third thing, and a really important thing for New Zealand, is that we are a small country and we have a very unbalanced economy. Our economy is dependent in terms of exports on dairy, and we're seeing the consequences of that now. Our domestic economy is now increasingly driven not by production, not by real jobs, but by speculation. And that's not a viable future. And so it's not enough to say, we can't do anything because we're part of a globalised world. We actually can do things in this country to change our direction. And I think one of the clearest messages for me in the book is, whilst there are predictions from various others that we are heading for a potential crisis because we have all of the trigger points, surely we can have that debate now and try to make some changes without having to go through the pain that Greece is going through, or Ireland did, or Iceland did.
Sure. All right, Jane. Well, thank you so much for joining us today. There's a lot to think about there, and important that you're raising this discussion. So thank you for that. I'm Janae Tibbs-Shirani, and I've been joined by Jane Kelsey here at interest.co.nz.